December 1944, a town frozen in silence beneath a sky of steel where the breath of every soldier turned to smoke in the air. The snow lay heavy across broken streets, covering the scars of shellfire, muffling the footsteps of men who knew they were surrounded. Darkness pressed down harder than the winter itself. It was not just the cold that bit into their bones, but the weight of numbers stacked against them. Thousands trapped inside a crumbling ring cut off from food, fuel, and hope. Outside an army larger, stronger, armed with tanks and artillery tightening its grip with every hour. Into this bleak stage came the image that burned itself into memory. Enemy officers walking forward beneath a white flag, a paper in their hands, an ultimatum written with confidence and contempt. They promised annihilation if surrender was not given, confident that hunger, frost, and fire would do their work. The imbalance was brutal. 18,000 against nearly twice as many, without supplies, without air cover, without mercy from the weather. Snowstorms, grounded planes, convoys never arrived, and the last road out was sealed shut. Every calculation said the defenders were finished. Every voice of reason whispered it was hopeless. And yet there was defiance, a spark of something raw and unmeasurable burning hotter than fear. Could men freezing in foxholes, starving in the ruins, truly withstand the weight of steel and fury pressing down on them? Could determination rewrite the laws of war itself? This was no ordinary siege. This was the moment when the arrogance of a mighty army collided with the unbroken will of those it thought already beaten. What happened next would silence the laughter of the conquerors and echo across history. The mathematics of war were about to be rewritten. The snow still fell in sheets burying the fields and forests in a silence that felt heavier than the weight of the sky itself. From the opening scene of enemy officers carrying their white flag and smug words of surrender, the story does not retreat backward. It surges deeper into the very roots of the storm that gave birth to that ultimatum. The siege of a town in December 1944 was not a sudden accident of war. It was the calculated strike of a regime desperate for one last miracle. The quiet of the opening moment shatters into the roar of artillery, and the audience is pulled violently from the eerie calm of the ultimatum into the furnace where it all began. This is where the first blow was struck, and where the foundations of that defiant no were laid in fire and blood. It began in darkness before dawn, when thousands of German guns opened fire in unison across the length of the Ardennes. The night air erupted into flame shells, tearing apart the frozen ground, shattering trees into splinters, drowning the quiet in thunder. Soldiers who had gone to sleep believing the war was nearly over woke in terror to find the very earth beneath them convulsing. They had been told the enemy was broken, that the Reich had nothing left to give. But what they faced in that moment was not weakness. It was a ferocious gamble, an all-in strike by an empire that knew defeat was near and sought to snatch one last chance at victory. In the flicker of those explosions, illusions were shattered. The German plan was merciless in its simplicity: hit hard, move fast, and drive straight through the Allied lines at their weakest point. At its heart lay the town that would later stand in defiance, a crossroads town that was not merely a cluster of buildings, but a vital artery of war. Whoever held it controlled the roads, the lifelines that could carry tanks to the port cities beyond. To the Germans, seizing it quickly meant opening the door to the sea and cutting the Allied armies in half. To the defenders, holding it meant survival itself. This was not just a tactical move, it was the difference between hope and collapse. Through the thick forests of the Ardennes, divisions that had been gathering in secret now rolled forward. Tanks rumbled beneath the trees, their engines muffled, supply wagons drawn by horses to avoid the noise of trucks. Radio silence was absolute, a cloak of deception that hid an entire army in plain sight. For days, thousands of men and machines had crept into position, unseen and unsuspected, waiting for the moment when the sky itself would split apart. And when it did, the effect was devastating. Entire American units found themselves swallowed before they could react. Lines buckling, men scattering into the snow, stunned by the speed and fury of the assault. Yet within this chaos, the seeds of defiance took root. Even as some positions crumbled, others clung stubbornly to the ground, buying minutes that would become hours. Hours that would become the fragile thread on which the fate of the town would hang. Outnumbered tank crews fired until their guns overheated, then repositioned to strike again. Young infantrymen, many still raw to combat, dug in deeper even as the frozen soil split their hands. The imbalance was crushing the attackers, came with overwhelming numbers, with armor and artillery in waves, with the advantage of surprise. But the defenders answered with grit, with the instinct not to break, with the desperate courage of men who knew retreat meant slaughter. The opening days of the offensive were a tide rolling forward, swallowing towns and villages one after another. Civilians fled into the snow, dragging children and meager belongings, their homes consumed in fire. Columns of German tanks punched through weak points while convoys of American soldiers stumbled back, dazed, some without weapons, some without boots. They shouted warnings to those still marching toward the front, their voices hoarse with panic. "Turn back, you'll all be killed." Yet the reinforcements pressed on their breath, freezing in the air, their eyes fixed on the looming storm. They were not walking toward safety. They were walking into the jaws of the beast. Every mile closed the circle tighter around the crossroads town. Every hour brought the attackers closer to their goal. And inside those snowy fields where foxholes froze solid and rifles jammed with ice, the question began to burn in every man's mind. How long could they last? They were facing not only an enemy stronger in numbers, but also the brutal indifference of winter. Frostbite gnawed at their toes. The cold cracked their skin. Water froze in their canteens. Hunger clawed at their stomachs. The artillery never stopped. The sky offered no relief, for the weather grounded the plains that might have brought them aid. In those early hours, survival seemed a dream fading into the snow. But history is never written only in numbers. It is written in resolve and the unmeasurable defiance that turns weakness into something immovable. The men who crouched in their trenches knew they were outnumbered, outgunned, cut off from supply. They knew that mathematically the battle was already lost. And yet they did not run. They dug deeper. They passed ammunition from frozen hands. They swore beneath their breath that they would not give an inch. What had begun as a perfect German plan now found itself grinding against a wall of resistance that should not have existed. From the very start, this clash was more than tanks and artillery. It was a collision of belief. One side believed victory was inevitable, that numbers and firepower could bend the world to their will. The other side believed only in survival, in holding one street, one trench, one frozen field, long enough for something to change. It was that belief, raw and desperate, that transformed the opening days of slaughter into the foundation of a legend. And so the ultimatum that would come later, carried under a white flag with arrogance in every line of its typewritten words, was born from this very storm. It was born from the overconfidence of an enemy who believed the defenders broken already, who believed surrender was the only possible end. But it was also born from the refusal of those defenders to break from the stubborn truth that even in the darkest hours they had not yielded. The clash had only begun, and the worst was yet to come. The question hung in the air, sharpened by every shell burst and every cry in the night. Could men without supplies, without warmth, without escape, truly defy the mathematics of war? Could they rewrite it through will alone? The first blow of the offensive had been struck with terrifying force, and the defenders had felt the full weight of it. Yet even as the snow settled over shattered villages and burning tanks, a spark remained. It was small, almost invisible against the overwhelming storm, but it was there waiting. That spark would carry through the siege, through the ultimatum, through the word that would echo forever. The white flag had already appeared in imagination, but the answer to it was being written in these very hours of terror. This was the beginning of the stand. This was the crucible where resolve was forged. And though no one knew it yet, the arrogance of the attackers was already sowing the seeds of their own downfall. For in that frozen silence, men had chosen not to surrender, but to fight until the end. The white flag of arrogance had barely vanished into memory when the true weight of the siege pressed down and the opening gunfire of the offensive gave way to something more suffocating, the slow tightening of the noose. The defenders, already battered by the first storm of artillery and the thunder of advancing armor, now felt the crushing reality of encirclement. The opening scene had placed them in a frozen trap, mocked by enemies who believed victory inevitable. But what came next was not merely the echo of that arrogance. It was the daily grinding truth of being cut off, surrounded, and left with no path but defiance. Columns of soldiers marched into the snow trucks, groaning under the weight of men and ammunition engines sputtering in the cold. They had been pulled from rest from towns far to the rear and hurled forward with no time to gather supplies or even winter coats. The order was simple and stark: reach the crossroads before the enemy does, or all will be lost. And so they rode through the night, crammed into open trucks, their breath forming clouds in the air, their weapons clutched against numb fingers. They passed streams of retreating men, faces pale with exhaustion, some limping, some without rifles, eyes wild with fear. Those men called out warnings into the darkness: turn back, you'll all be slaughtered. The tanks are everywhere. The roads are death. But the trucks rolled on. No one turned back. By the time they reached the outskirts, the circle was already closing. German armor had pushed hard from multiple directions, their divisions spreading like claws through the countryside. Every road into the town was contested. Every field became a battlefield. Units scrambled into position without maps, relying on instinct and rumor, digging foxholes in frozen ground with helmets when shovels broke. The snow-muffled sound, but in the stillness beyond the lines came the grinding, ominous noise of engines, tanks, moving unseen in the dark, their weight shaking the earth. Civilians huddled in cellars, children pressed to their mothers' chests as artillery shells tore apart roofs overhead. The town itself was no longer a sanctuary. It was a cage. Inside this tightening trap, the imbalance of power was merciless. The defenders numbered in the tens of thousands, but the enemy outside counted more, with battalions of infantry, armored divisions, and heavy artillery waiting for the kill. Fuel and food were scarce from the first day. Ammunition had to be rationed, every shell accounted, for every bullet precious. Medics already found themselves without enough bandages, forced to cut strips of cloth from their own clothing. Frostbite gnawed at men's feet, blackened their skin, made every step agony. Hunger and cold became enemies as dangerous as the tanks outside the perimeter. And yet within this growing suffocation, there was also steel. The men who had been told to retreat refused to abandon their posts. Outposts held their ground against overwhelming odds, delaying the advance of entire enemy battalions for hours at a time. Tank crews fought in fog so thick they could barely see their targets, firing blindly until shells found their mark. At Noville, a small combat team stood against the weight of an armored division, their Sherman tanks shuddering as their shells bounced uselessly off enemy armor until they maneuvered close enough to strike from the side. They were outmatched, outgunned, and crushed by numbers, but they bought time, precious, irreplaceable time, that would allow the town to dig in deeper. The pressure mounted with every sunrise. German artillery began a relentless pounding, shells raining down on the streets, turning houses into rubble and setting barns ablaze. Smoke and snow mingled into a gray veil that never lifted. Civilians emerged only to pull wounded neighbors from the ruins before retreating again into the earth. A Belgian nurse worked tirelessly in the makeshift aid stations, treating enemy and ally alike until her own life was taken in the bombardment. Her death became a symbol of the siege itself, compassion crushed beneath indiscriminate destruction, yet remembered as a beacon of courage. By the end of the second day, the defenders were completely encircled. The last road had been cut, the last lifeline severed. Messages sent out to higher command spoke plainly they were trapped. Supplies could not reach them. Reinforcements were too far. The enemy believed the trap was perfect, that resistance would crumble under its weight. It was at this moment, when the jaws had closed fully, that the defiance from the opening scene began to glow brighter. For every calculation of the attackers, every measure of strength and weakness had missed the one element they could not measure: the will to endure. From foxholes carved into ice, men stared into the night and listened to tanks growling in the distance. They gripped rifles with frozen hands, their bodies aching, their stomachs empty, their futures uncertain. They knew they were cut off. They knew no help could arrive in time. And yet, they dug in deeper. They braced themselves. They whispered oaths into the cold. In the balance of war, the scales had tilted entirely against them, but something far heavier was now being placed on their side: determination, raw and unyielding. The siege had begun not as a sudden collapse but as a steady tightening and inexorable weight pressing in from every direction. What the enemy saw as inevitability, the defenders now faced as challenge. They had no illusions. They were trapped. But in that trap, they discovered the power to resist. The arrogance of the white flag ultimatum had only set the stage. The real story was unfolding here in the snow and smoke of a town refusing to die. And the question that burned brighter with every passing hour was not whether they could escape, but how long they could endure, and what price the enemy would pay for believing them already beaten. The arrogance of the enemy's ultimatum still lingered in the cold air when the moment came that defined the siege. Inside the town, surrounded by walls of snow and steel, the defenders braced themselves for the inevitable question: would they submit or would they defy? The siege had already revealed its cruelty. Ammunition was rationed to a trickle food cut to scraps, and every night the ground shook with the weight of artillery. Men fought frostbite as fiercely as they fought enemy fire. Civilians prayed in the shadows of cellars, their world collapsing overhead. And then out of that darkness came the emissaries of mockery enemy officers stepping forward under a white flag, carrying a message that promised survival through surrender. It was an offer dressed in formality, but dripping with contempt. It was not mercy. It was a demand for humiliation. They carried their typed ultimatum, as if the paper itself were a weapon, spelling out what seemed undeniable. The defenders were hopelessly surrounded, their annihilation, certain their only chance for survival, lying in immediate surrender. The words were sharp, clinical, and absolute. The enemy's confidence was staggering. They believed their numbers, their armor, and the brutal grip of winter had already crushed the spirit of those within the town. They thought the defenders' choice was not if they would fall, but how they would choose to die. The letter promised destruction, a rain of shells and fire that would erase the town if surrender was not granted. To the enemy, this was not a negotiation. It was a performance, the smug satisfaction of conquerors already savoring their victory. When the paper reached headquarters, it found the commander not at a grand desk, but lying exhausted, trying to snatch a few moments of rest in the basement of a battered barracks. He was roused from sleep and handed the ultimatum, words of doom pressed into his palm. He scanned it, listened to the explanation, and his first instinct was not despair, but scorn. His response, spoken almost casually, would become immortal. One word, short, sharp, and dripping with defiance: nuts. It was not the language of diplomacy, not the carefully measured phrasing of an officer choosing his words for history. It was raw, it was visceral, it was the unfiltered truth of a soldier who refused to bow. That single word carried the weight of an army. To his staff, it was perfect, uncompromising, fearless, almost mocking. They urged him to make it the official reply. And so it was written down and handed back to the enemy's representatives. When they read it, confusion rippled across their faces. Nuts. What does this mean? They asked. The reply they received was equally blunt. It means, go to hell. In that moment, the battle ceased to be about numbers, or positions, or even strategy. It became a clash of spirits, a war of willpower. The enemy's contempt had been answered not with negotiation, not with hesitation, but with defiance that cut deeper than bullets. The effect on the defenders was electric. Word of the reply spread through the lines like fire. Men who had been half frozen in their foxholes, who had rationed their last scraps of food, who had stared into the darkness wondering how long they could last, now felt something surge within them. They were not just holding out, they were standing in open defiance. They had been mocked, cornered, written off, and now they answered with laughter, with stubborn courage, with a refusal so absolute it seemed almost reckless. But it was not reckless, it was resolve. It was the spirit of men who would rather die fighting than live on their knees. The enemy's reaction was predictable rage. If the defenders would not submit, then they would be punished. Bombers roared overhead, shells rained down the town, shook under the fury of an army determined to crush insolence. But the very act of unleashing that fury proved the enemy had been shaken. Their certainty was cracked. They had believed surrender was inevitable, that the defenders were already broken. Instead, they were mocked, told to their faces that their power, their threats, their calculations meant nothing. The one-word reply, nuts, did more than resist it, humiliated. and humiliation cut deeper than loss of ground. Inside the town, the siege ground on, but something fundamental had changed. The defenders no longer asked themselves if they could survive. They asked only how long they could hold, how much they could endure, how much they could make the enemy bleed for every step. The white flag of arrogance had been answered with the iron will of defiance. What the enemy thought would be the end had become a beginning. The word echoed in every frozen foxhole, every battered street, every cellar filled with wounded. It was not just a response, it was a vow. This was the turning point of spirit, the moment when the mathematics of war faltered against something immeasurable. The encircled garrison had no fuel, no reinforcements, no way out. But they had resolve. And resolve once ignited cannot be extinguished by bombs or snow or tanks. The ultimatum had been intended to break them. Instead, it forged them into something unbreakable. And as the fires of the bombardment lit the night sky, one truth became undeniable. The siege would not end in surrender. It would end in either destruction or deliverance, and the enemy would pay dearly for their mistake in believing the defenders already beaten. The word nuts still echoed through the frozen air when the weight of reality came crashing down again. Defiance was a spark, a flame burning against the darkness, but sparks alone could not feed men who had gone days without proper meals. The siege did not pause to admire their courage. The enemy answered the insult with fire, and the sky itself seemed to split apart as shells and bombs rained down on the battered town. The ground trembled with every explosion, buildings crumbled into rubble, and the night glowed with flames licking at the snow. For the men trapped inside, there was no comfort in knowing they had answered boldly. Hunger clawed at their stomachs, frostbitten feet blackened in their boots, and wounded men cried out in aid stations where supplies had already run dry. The word had given them pride, but pride could not silence the gnawing truth. They were still surrounded, still starving, still bleeding, and the circle around them only grew tighter. Every foxhole was a coffin of frozen mud. Soldiers crouched in the icy trenches, breath misting in the darkness, their rifles icy to the touch. They took turns sleeping in shifts, for to close their eyes too long risked freezing to death. To leave their cover, even for moments, invited sniper fire or artillery fragments. They melted snow over scraps of burning cardboard just to drink water. Their rations dwindled to almost nothing. Scraps of bread, a tin of beans split among men who burned thousands of calories simply shivering in the cold. Some hacked at the carcasses of frozen horses left behind by the enemy, gnawing on the bitter, stringy meat to survive. This was not warfare as strategy. This was survival stripped bare. In the shattered aid stations, doctors and medics worked with desperate ingenuity. Anesthetics had run out, so wounded men were given swigs of cognac before the scalpel cut. Bandages were torn from shirts, belts, and bed sheets. Operations were performed by candlelight when generators failed. Nurses who had worked without rest for days fell where they stood, collapsing from exhaustion or struck down in the bombardments that tore through the town indiscriminately. When bombs buried entire aid posts beneath rubble, survivors clawed through debris with bare hands, listening to the muffled cries of men trapped beneath, calling for mothers who would never come. In this hell, humanity was a fragile thread stretched to its breaking point. The enemy pressed harder. Tanks rolled closer each dawn, their engines growling through the fog, their black silhouettes appearing like monsters in the snow. Infantry in white camouflage crept forward, nearly invisible until they were upon the lines. The defenders answered with what little they had: bazookas, rifles, sheer grit. But each attack drained more of their strength, more of their ammunition, more of their hope. And still the circle did not break. Still the artillery thundered. Still the frost sank deeper into their bones. The siege had become a test not just of courage, but of endurance. Yet even in this furnace of despair, the defiance planted in the reply to the ultimatum refused to die. Men huddled in foxholes whispered that single word, like a prayer, a curse, a promise: nuts. It became their anchor in the storm, their refusal to yield when everything screamed at them to quit. They knew the enemy expected them to collapse under hunger and cold. They knew the ultimatum had been written with the arrogance of conquerors. convinced the defenders were already finished. And every day they survived beyond that expectation was a victory in itself. The civilians, too, bore the weight of this defiance. Families crouched in underground cellars as bombs shook the earth. Mothers held their children tighter with every blast, whispering comfort, while walls shook and ceilings cracked. Some chose to remain in the shattered aid stations, helping however they could, sharing meager food, risking their lives under fire. They had no weapons, no uniforms, but their endurance fed the spirit of the defenders. For when soldiers saw that even the helpless refused to abandon hope, they themselves found the strength to keep fighting. Still, the pressure grew merciless. Ammunition was nearly gone. Medical supplies, exhausted food nearly vanished. Every calculation said the garrison could not hold another day. The enemy believed the defiant word would soon collapse under starvation. But something far stronger had taken root. The siege was no longer about survival alone. It had become a matter of honor, of identity, of proving that even when starved, frozen, and battered free men would not bend to tyranny. The town had become a crucible, a furnace that tested the soul as much as the body. The defiant reply had been the spark. Now the question was whether that spark could burn long enough to outlast the storm. In the snow-filled nights as bombs fell and hunger gnawed, the answer was written not in grand speeches, but in silent acts. A soldier sharing the last crust of bread with his comrade. A medic dragging another man from the rubble. A civilian refusing to flee. Each act was a refusal to surrender. Each moment, a reminder that the siege could break their bodies, but not their spirit. The arrogance of the enemy had been answered once, with words. Now it was answered daily with endurance. And though the town seemed buried under fire and ice, its defenders carried within them something the enemy had not accounted for: the will to hold no matter the cost. They had defied the ultimatum, and now they defied reality itself. The siege tightened, the bombs fell, the hunger deepened, but still, they stood still, they endured. And with every passing day, the balance of war shifted unseen but unstoppable toward a reckoning the enemy had never imagined. The siege had dragged into days that felt like years, and the defiant word hurled back at the enemy's arrogance. Nuts still carried its echo through the trenches and shattered streets. Yet defiance alone did not stop the cold from slicing through flesh, nor did it fill empty stomachs or close the gaping wounds of the dying. By now the siege was no longer merely a military standoff. It had become a descent into a living hell. The men inside the circle were gaunt and hollow-eyed, their bodies trembling from hunger and frostbite, their spirits tested by the endless thunder of artillery that turned every sunrise into another round of torment. The question from the beginning whether they could endure was no longer abstract. It was carved into every scar, every scream, every step taken in snow that had long since turned red. The artillery never ceased. Night and day the shells fell, cracking open the earth, turning homes into rubble, tearing trees into splinters. Men in their foxholes pressed themselves into the frozen ground, praying to survive each barrage. When silence did fall, it was not relief, but dread, because silence meant the tanks were coming. In the pale dawn light, black hulks rolled out of the fog, their turrets swinging their cannons, pounding the earth. Infantry in white camouflage moved with them like ghosts, bayonets, fixed rifles ready. The defenders fought back with what little they had, bazooka rounds that bounced off armor rifles that froze in their hands, courage that refused to bend. Tank destroyers hidden among the ruins waited for the perfect shot, unleashing hell when the steel beasts rumbled past. Each clash left the battlefield littered with burned-out wrecks, smoking ruins, and bodies stiff in the snow. But if the battlefield was brutal, the rear lines were worse. The aid stations had become chambers of agony. Wounded men lay shoulder to shoulder on floors soaked with blood blankets, too few to cover their shivering bodies. Surgeons worked by the flicker of candles, their hands raw and blistered from the cold, their tools reused until they were blunt. Anesthetics had run out. Soldiers bit down on belts as saws cut through bone. Morphine was gone. A splash of liquor was the only relief. When bombs hit an aid station, collapsing it into rubble, survivors clawed desperately at the debris to pull the living from the dead. but too often they found only silence. Nurses, who had tended the wounded for days without sleep, now gave their lives beside them, martyrs of compassion, swallowed by the cruelty of war. Hunger gnawed at everyone without mercy. The official ration had shrunk to almost nothing, half a meal a day, sometimes less. Men scraped the bottoms of tins for crumbs, boiled snow for water, chewed on leather straps to trick their stomachs into silence. Frozen horse carcasses left by the enemy became the only source of meat hacked apart with bayonets and cooked over makeshift fires of broken ammunition boxes. It was bitter and stringy, but it kept them alive. In foxholes, men whispered of Christmas dinners back home, mothers' kitchens, the warmth of firesides they might never see again. The contrast between memory and reality was a torment sharper than hunger itself. The cold was merciless. Frostbite blackened toes and fingers until they turned to stone. Medics cut boots from men's feet, only to find flesh frozen solid. Some men wept silently as they watched their own toes fall away. Others simply stared with empty eyes past the point of pain. Guards rotated not for strategy, but to prevent death by freezing. To urinate outside a foxhole was to risk sniper fire, so men filled ration tins, instead clutching them like desperate lifelines. The war had stripped them of dignity, but it had not taken their will. That will was what kept them alive in a wasteland where reason itself said survival was impossible. And yet, in this abyss, the spirit of defiance refused to die. Nuts was no longer just a word scrawled on paper. It became a creed, muttered in the trenches, a vow whispered by the wounded, a shield against despair. Every day they survived was a victory. Every moment endured was a slap in the face of the enemy who had promised their annihilation. The arrogance of the ultimatum had been replaced by desperation. As the besiegers realized, the defenders would not collapse. Instead, the circle of steel pressed harder. The bombardments grew heavier, the attacks more frenzied, but the men inside had made a decision they would not bow. If they were to die, it would be with rifles in their hands, spitting their last defiance into the face of their enemy. The siege had become a crucible, stripping away everything but raw endurance. It was no longer about tactics or weapons or numbers. It was about willpower, about the human spirit when pressed to the very edge of annihilation. In that frozen town, buried under fire and ice, the defenders wrote a truth that could not be erased. You can surround men, starve them, freeze them, bury them under shells. But if they refuse to yield, then you have not conquered them. And as the days dragged on and the enemy failed again and again to break through, the weight of that truth grew heavier than all the tanks, all the shells, all the arrogance the enemy had brought to the battlefield. The mathematics of war said the defenders should already have been dead. But war is not fought on paper. It is fought in the hearts of men. And in that place, in those hours of hell, the defenders discovered a strength that no calculation could measure. The enemy had mocked them, demanded their surrender, promised annihilation. Instead, they stood starving, freezing, bleeding, but unbroken. The siege had turned into something greater than survival. It had become defiance, made flesh endurance carved into stone, and a promise that this fight was not over. The siege had reached its darkest hour. Hunger gnawed like a blade at every stomach. Frostbite crept up every limb. Artillery thundered without mercy. And yet the defenders held, clinging to their single word of defiance, nuts. They had rejected surrender, chosen endurance, and paid for it with blood and agony. But war is not static. War shifts like the snow-laden winds, and in that winter of despair, the first signs of change whispered through the storm. Far to the south, while the defenders were being crushed under fire, another force stirred. A man whose very name struck fear and awe. A general who promised the impossible. The story that had begun with arrogance and mockery now tilted toward an answer the enemy had never anticipated. Deliverance born of audacity. General George S. Patton was not a man of hesitation. Where others saw disaster, he smelled opportunity. When the ultimatum had been laughed off with nuts, the defenders inside the ring did not know if anyone could reach them. They were told no supplies could pass through, no reinforcements could arrive in time. The enemy believed this too, convinced that the town would starve and freeze into silence. But Patton, hundreds of miles away, was already plotting a move that defied every law of logistics, every calculation of reason. He promised to turn his entire army north in winter conditions across icy roads and through storms faster than any force of its size had ever moved. Even Eisenhower himself doubted it could be done. But Patton was not boasting. He had already prepared, already laid fuel dumps, and mapped routes, already envisioned this exact moment. While the enemy mocked the trapped garrison, Patton whispered to his staff one word that set destiny in motion: play ball. From that moment, 25,000 men and 133,000 vehicles shifted like a tidal wave, grinding through ice and blizzards with engines roaring, headlights blacked out, drivers half asleep at their wheels. Tanks consumed gallons of fuel by the minute. Trucks slid into ditches, roads clogged with snow and wreckage. Yet the columns did not stop. Fuel was poured by hand from jerry cans, track links replaced in the freezing dark, artillery recalculated for new positions. Men marched through the night, falling asleep on their feet, shaken awake by comrades who refused to let them drop. Every soldier knew who they were marching toward. They were not moving for glory, or for medals, or even for victory. They were moving for the men trapped inside the ring, the ones who had refused to surrender. They were moving to prove that defiance would not be abandoned. Inside the town, hope flickered when the skies, long choked with snow and fog, finally cleared. For the first time in days, sunlight broke through the clouds. The defenders lifted their eyes and saw the impossible: the drone of aircraft filling the sky, the silhouettes of C-47 transports cutting across the horizon. Then came the blossoms of parachutes, hundreds of them drifting like salvation through the frozen air. Ammunition, food, bandages, blankets, all the things they had prayed for, came tumbling down from the heavens. Men wept openly as they dragged the supplies in, even as shells burst around them. One soldier, bleeding from shrapnel, dragged a crate to cover before collapsing with a smile. For 7 days they had been alone, mocked, starved, shelled, and now the sky itself had come to their aid. The enemy answered with rage. Bombers roared overhead, strafing the town, pounding it with even greater fury. Christmas Eve turned into a vision of hell, as churches, homes, and even aid stations were obliterated in fire. Wounded men and medics alike were buried beneath rubble, their cries fading into silence. Yet the enemy could not erase what had been delivered: supplies, hope, and the knowledge that relief was on the way. The defenders had survived the impossible long enough, and now beyond the horizon, Patton's tanks ground forward with unstoppable determination. And then on December 26, it happened. After days of brutal fighting, yard by yard, through snow and ice, the first Shermans crested a ridge outside the besieged town. Their turrets swung, their guns fired, and behind them came the rumble of liberation. The defenders, gaunt and hollow-eyed, climbed from their foxholes and cheered with voices cracked from hunger and frost. Men embraced tears freezing on their cheeks as the realization sank in they were no longer alone. The siege had been broken. The enemy's arrogance, their certainty of annihilation, had collapsed beneath the roar of engines and the fire of defiance. For the attackers, it was more than a tactical failure. It was humiliation. They had promised annihilation, demanded surrender, boasted of certain victory. Instead, they had been mocked with a single word, defied through starvation and frost, and finally shattered by an army that moved with impossible speed. One German officer would later confess, "You have won not because of numbers or weapons, but because of spirit." That spirit had held the line long enough for Patton's audacity to arrive. The siege that began with arrogance ended in revelation. The enemy had learned a bitter lesson: you cannot calculate the will of men who refuse to break. The defenders had been written off as doomed, their annihilation assured. Yet they endured, they defied, and they endured long enough to see salvation burst through the snow. The mathematics of war had indeed been rewritten, not by firepower alone, but by defiance, endurance, and an audacious promise kept. What began with a white flag of mockery ended with tanks roaring through the snow and with the truth carved forever into history: free men fighting together cannot be conquered. The siege of that frozen town was more than just a battle. It was a test of human endurance, of spirit against steel, of defiance against overwhelming odds. From the arrogance of the enemy's ultimatum to the single-word reply that echoed through history every moment revealed the same truth: free men do not surrender easily. They starved, they froze, they bled. And yet they held their ground until Patton's tanks carved through the snow and shattered the chains of encirclement. The mathematics of war, once certain of their annihilation, had been broken by something no calculation could measure: the unyielding will of those who refused to quit. But this is not just history. It is a story of spirit, of courage, of ordinary men made extraordinary by the fire of war. And now, I want to hear from you. If you were trapped in that frozen town, surrounded on all sides, starving and wounded, would you have the strength to fight on? Or would you choose surrender to survive? Drop your thoughts in the comments below, because every answer tells us something about who we are today. And don't forget, this is only one chapter of a larger war filled with untold stories of defiance, sacrifice, and unexpected triumphs. What came after Bastogne changed the course of the war forever, and the question remains: how far can determination carry men when the world believes they are already defeated? Subscribe and stay with us, because the next story will take you even deeper into the fire of history, where fate was decided not by numbers, but by spirit. The battle may have ended, but the journey into the heart of courage has only just begun.